welcome to the first event in the spring semester of the Park Street series in Health, Humanities, and Ethics. I'm Amy Boski, and with my colleague, Father Jim Keenan, I have the honor of directing this speaker series, which is now in its third year, and it's been made possible by the generous bequest from the Sullivan family in honor of the late Father Quinn, whose dedication to community conversations about social justice have found an important legacy here as we welcome speakers on topics related to the larger conversation on health, humanity, and ethics. So for each of the past few years, we've worked with faculty across the university and with students to develop a broader theme on a topic related to this larger question. This year, that theme is loosely organized around the idea of the common good. Tonight's speaker introduces a critical subject in that domain. And we're grateful to have Andrew Solomon here with us. He'll be introduced by Andrea Haberlein from BC's Department of Psychology. So can I ask if everyone can move forward again? Are there any open seats? If you could raise your hand if people need to move forward and would like to sit down, please do. And take this moment to make sure that your cell phone is turned off or turned to silence. And now Andrea will come up to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
It is a pleasure and an honor to introduce Andrew Solomon to you tonight. I first encountered Solomon through his 2012 book, Far from the Tree, a phenomenally wide-ranging, exhaustively researched, and deeply empathic work about relationships between parents and extraordinary children. Children who differ from their parents in ways that profoundly shape their identities. Deafness, Down syndrome, extreme talents, transgender, and several others, 10 in all. This marvelous work, the culmination of 10 years of research, received honors including the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction, and once one of New York Times' 10 best books for 2012. Gail Caldwell has described Solomon's voice as smart and compassionate, and it is indeed this balance of traits, a wide-ranging, analytical, deep-diving intellect paired with a persistent and thoughtful humanity that illuminates his work. It's satisfying reading for a scientist with deft and accurate characterizations of scientific research. It's beautifully written, and in addition it is characterized by an essential human empathy. Andrew Solomon was born in New York. He went to the Horace Mann School, received a BA in English from Yale in 1985, then a master's in English at Jesus College, Cambridge. He's been a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, as well as many other magazines and newspapers, writing on a truly astonishing array of topics. He's the author of 5 books, the first of which focused on Russian artists. The second was a critically acclaimed novel. Solomon's most recent book is his 2016 Far and Away, Reporting from the Brink of Change, in which he focuses on his experiences while traveling. Both a journalist and a scholar, Solomon received a PhD in psychology from Jesus College, Cambridge in 2013. He's a prominent LGBT rights activist who's been honored with awards and board memberships for his advocacy for LGBT rights, for mental health, and intersections between the two. Solomon is the president of the PEN America Center, which promotes and protects freedom of expression, and is a professor of clinical psychology at Columbia University Medical Center. The Noonday Demon was published in 2001. It won the National Book Award for Nonfiction, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and won numerous other awards. This book is sometimes described as a memoir of depression, which it is, but it is also a scholarly work on depression's causes, manifestations, and treatments. Reviewing The Noonday Demon in The Guardian, Ian Penman described the work as, quote, formidably well-researched. The Boston Globe's Gail Caldwell called it, quote, an ambitious compendium of fact, anecdote, and insight, viewing depression through the prisms of cultural, medical, and political circumstances. Solomon has titled his talk tonight, The Secret We Share. The World Health Organization forecasted that depression would become the second leading cause of disability worldwide by 2020. Lifetime prevalence of depression varies around the world, but in the US it has been estimated at close to 17%. In other words, 17% of US adults have had at least one episode of major depression in their lifetimes. Recent statistics from the National Institutes for Mental Health found that 6.7% of all US adults have had at least one major depressive episode within the past year. Among the 6.7% of the population, a subset, 4.3% of all US adults, reported a major depressive episode with severe impairment. In other words, more than 10 million adults in the United States were partly or fully incapacitated by depression within the year of 2016. According to that same survey, more than a third of the adults who met criteria for a major depressive episode received no treatment. Depression frequently co-occurs with anxiety, and I could cite similar statistics about the prevalence of anxiety disorders, which, if anything, are more prevalent. For example, about 20% prevalence among US adults within the past year. So why is this widely shared experience still a secret? And why is this level of prevalence surprising, possibly even to people who have themselves experienced depression? In a culture that prizes agency and competence, we can talk about our feelings, but only some of them. Since there are undergraduate students in the audience, I'm just going to take this quick opportunity to announce University Counseling Service has a psychologist on call and available by telephone 24/7 and walk-in hours in the basement of Gasson, this building, during weekday working hours. However, if you feel like it's an emergency for yourself or another person, dialing 911 is absolutely appropriate. So given the prevalence of depression and anxiety, it's all the more incumbent on all of us to understand these, and few are better equipped to help us do so than Dr. Solomon. I attended a recent talk by a clinical psychologist discussing anxiety. He referred to people with anxiety disorders. Remember, 20% of us will meet this classification at some point in our lives as them. In a room with at least 40 people in it, one couldn't help but wonder how many thems were present. Shouldn't the term really be us, or at least many among us? Solomon's narrative of his own depression rings deeply, validatingly familiar to many. Reviewers on Amazon describe buying new copies to replace their tattered old copies and wanting everyone close to them to read the book. Those of us who have less deep familiarity with major depression may be experiencing dysthymic states just persistent or numbing enough to sense the depths of what might follow, might feel both a resonance and a sense, but there but for some grace go we. Christopher Caldwell wrote that everyone will find a piece of himself in Solomon's account of depression. I think, though, that the reason this work is used as a text in clinical psychology and psychiatry training is because, in addition to the depth and breadth of his scholarship, it makes vivid and even relatable Solomon's lived experience of depression for people who haven't shared that experience. People for whom those with depression might easily be them. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Solomon.
You all. It's an honor to be here at Boston College and in this beautiful room. It's thrilling that so many of you have turned out, and it's particularly thrilling. I was thinking on the train today as I was going up here, I thought I really should go through and try to update some statistics, and now you have them all, so I don't have to touch on them at all. I felt a funeral in my mind, and mourners to and fro, kept marching till I felt that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating till I felt my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift the box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as if the heavens were a bell and being were an ear, and I and silence some strange race wrecked, solitary here. Just then a plank in reason broke, and I fell down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. That's Emily Dickinson, a poem that I think brilliantly sums up a lot of what the experience of depression is really like, a funeral in my brain. The sort of relentlessness of it, the darkness of it, the sense of loss and confusion that go with it. She captures it beautifully. When I set out to do research in the area of depression, an area to which I was drawn, as mentioned in the introduction, by my own dalliances with depression myself, but I started off to research it, and I was really interested in addressing what I saw as two problems in the way people think about depression. The first thing was that I think people tend to think of depression as a modern Western middle-class illness. And I wanted to establish that depression has existed across time, that it's existed across cultures, that it's existed across socioeconomic groups. But the other piece of it is that I was struck as I began doing research by the fact that I met some people who had what sounded, as they described it, like relatively minor depression, but were nonetheless completely disabled by it. And I met other people who had what sounded, as they described it, symptomatically, like more major depression, but one way or another they were able to have rich and meaningful lives, at least in the interstices between their depressive episodes. And I was interested in understanding why that would be. I also think that we have to look at the relationship between personality and illness, at what depression really is, and try to understand it. And I felt when I looked at the literature that existed around depression that it tended to be quite specialized. There were personal memoirs, which were very interesting, but really about one person. There were psychological texts, there were philosophical texts, there were medical texts, but there was a kind of chaos in the kingdom, and there was a need to try to find a way to unify them and pull them all together. And that was one of the things that I felt it would be possible for me to do. So I'll begin with my own experience of depression. When I was growing up, I had always thought of myself as a kind of tough guy. I had thought that I was the sort of person who, if I had found myself in a concentration camp, would have been one of the survivors who stuck with it and made my way through under the most adverse circumstances imaginable. And so I was very shocked at the arrival of depression in my realm of experience. In 1991, my mother died, and I began writing a novel which was partly based on her illness and death, and in 1994 I published it. And in a curious way, that was more of a final leave-taking than it had been when she had died. And then a relationship I was in foundered, and a variety of things went awry and went wrong, and I began to find myself more and more bored by things. I would pick up a book and read a page and think, that's not really very interesting. Or I would eat something and I would think, I'm not going to finish that. I just had a detachment from all of the experience around me. And I often say the opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. And it was vitality that seemed to seep away from me in those moments. The essence of being alive, the vigor with which one is ordinarily alive. And after the period of being bored, I got to a period in which everything seemed like a lot of work. A lot of work. And I would come home and I would listen to the messages people had left for me. And I would think, not that I was glad to have heard from friends, but just what a lot of people that is to have to call back. What a lot of people that is to have to interact with. And I would feel overwhelmed by it. And I thought that was so strange and so unlike the way I had always felt about contact with friends. And then I would think to myself, well, I should have lunch. But I think that if I have lunch, I have to get the food out, and I have to put it on a plate, and I have to sit down, and I have to cut it, and I have to chew it, and I have to swallow it. And all of those efforts began to feel to me like the Stations of the Cross. And one of the things that's left out a lot of the time in conversations about depression is that it's ridiculous. And you know it's ridiculous while you're experiencing it. You know that people get up and they have lunch, or they get up and they take a shower. I would find myself getting up and making it as far as the bathroom and turning on the shower and then feeling too overwhelmed to get under the water and having to go and sit down and wait for a while I thought about it before I finally forced myself in. It's ridiculous and you know it's ridiculous. Most people take a shower every day. Most people. And they don't have any particular emotional challenge in doing it. And so you think to yourself, but how can I possibly be feeling like this? This is idiotic. And yet it is incontrovertibly and absolutely the way that you feel. So I found myself doing and thinking and being less and less and less. And then the anxiety set in. Depression and anxiety are related biologically and they're related experientially. And if you told me I had to be depressed for the next month, I would say, well, as long as it's going to be over in March, I guess I could do that for a month. Because part of what's so poisonous about depression when you live it is the feeling that it will never end, that things will never get any better, that you're destined to this forever. But if you said to me that I had to be acutely anxious for the next month, I would have to think really seriously about whether I could endure that at all and whether I could stay alive through it. It's the feeling of being afraid every instant, but not knowing what it is that you're afraid of. It's the feeling of being completely out of control that you have, for example, if you fall down. But if you fall down a flight of stairs, you have that feeling for maybe 5 seconds, maybe 8 seconds, and here it goes on day after day, week after week. It stretches on and on and on, this sense of incredible difficulty and horror of everything that you have to do. And at some point there, I began to think that being alive was possibly too painful. And I was feeling more and more paralyzed. I'd been slowed by the depression and I was paralyzed by the anxiety. And I remember waking up one day and thinking, I should call someone for help. But I didn't have the wherewithal to reach out from my bed to the phone that was on the bedside table and call anyone. And I lay there just staring at the ceiling for most of the day, thinking almost that I might have had a stroke because I felt so immobilized. And finally the phone rang, and it was my father. And I said to him, I don't know what's happened to me, but I'm not in good shape. And he said, I'll be right there. And that was the beginning of going to therapists, and the beginning of taking medication, and the beginning of exploring all of the other approaches that there were to getting better. And those approaches helped me to get better. And when I felt better, I thought, well, good, I'm through with that. And so then I went off the medication and stopped going to therapy, and then I relapsed into depression again. And I then got better, and then I got depressed again, and then I got better, and then I got depressed again. And it became this almost ritual series of things until I finally accepted that I was going to need to avail myself of treatment over the much longer term. And all of these questions came up, the existential questions that come to some extent with depression, but even more with the emergence from depression. Who am I? Am I that strong person who could deal with so much adversity, who I thought I was when I was growing up? Or am I somehow a weak and enfeebled person, somebody who has only the ability to live within the confines of this terrible illness? And if I'm taking these medications, are these medications turning me into someone else? Or are they helping me to be more of myself? And those questions were very difficult ones to answer. Now, I had two major advantages as I started out in this domain. The first is that I knew that I had, objectively speaking, quite a nice life. And so I knew that there was something on the other side, and that if I could only get over the depression, there was something waiting for me that I could respond to. And the other is that I had access to good treatment. Since the publication of my book, I get probably now between 10 and 20 letters a week from people with depression writing to me from all over the world. And many of them have taken the brave step of seeking treatment, but are not getting good treatment. And you say to them, you know, I'm not a doctor, and I'm not in Brazil, and I don't know where you should go, but whatever help you're getting right now doesn't sound like it's being very helpful to you. And if you had a broken leg and they were trying to fix it and you couldn't stand after months and months of treatment, you would try to find someone else to treat you. And you sometimes need to do that with depression too. Anyway, the chemical and the psychological were then the question. Did I have a chemical imbalance in my brain, or did I have something that had gone wrong in my mind? And what was the relationship between my brain and my mind? And it took me a long time and a lot of research to understand that those are two different vocabularies for the same set of phenomena. That whatever you're feeling is manifest in the chemistry of your brain, and whatever you're feeling is an emotional truth within the confines of which you live and exist. And understanding the brain should never preclude understanding the mind, or vice versa. The treatments we have for depression are appalling. They're expensive, they have a lot of side effects, and they're not that effective for everyone. They're effective for only a certain proportion of people who respond to them. And I am grateful to live now and not 50 years ago, because 50 years ago the treatments that have helped me would have been unavailable, and I wouldn't be up here giving you a lecture. I would be at home in bed with the covers pulled over my head. But I hope that in 50 years people look back on the medications that I take today and say, how could anyone have taken such primitive treatment, such awful treatment for this situation of depression? Depression is the flaw in love. That's the opening line of my book, The Noonday Demon, and it's something that I believe deeply. Depression is part of what allows us to experience love. If you thought, well, I'm very happily married, but if my husband died, I'd just find another one. It wouldn't be love as we know it. Love as we know it has to do with the anticipation of loss, with the sense of I might fall apart without this person, with a sense of vulnerability. And depression is the extreme end of that vulnerability. But I want to draw a distinction. The mood spectrum is one of the most useful things we have. The ability to be angry at one moment and joyful in another moment and sad in another moment. That is unbelievably important to our experience of the world, and without it, we would be inhuman. But there's a difference between that mood spectrum with all of its richness and all of its challenges and really major clinical depression when it goes way off in the other direction. And we have a kind of poverty of the language that the word depression gets used to describe not only the way a child feels when his baseball game gets canceled because it's raining out, but also the way that someone feels the minute before he or she commits suicide. And because we use the same word for that whole range of experience, people think that they understand when you talk about depression what it is that you're talking about, because they've been depressed too sometimes and they've just gone on with things. But this kind of depression is different. And I've sometimes said, it's like the difference between discovering that you have some rust on the fence outside your house. There's a little spot and you have to sand it down and you have to paint over it with rust protective paint and you have to get on with things. And the experience if you were to leave that fence for 10 years in the pouring rain and abandon the house until it had collapsed into a heap of dust. It's the leading disability worldwide, and it's a dangerous, dangerous condition. People die from it. Suicide is one of the leading causes of death in the United States. More people die of gun suicide every year in the United States than die of gun homicide every year in the United States. More young people die of suicide than of anything else except for accidents and one other thing that young people die from a lot. So it's the third leading cause of death among younger people in the United States. And the people who are going to die of it are often, it's difficult to see them. My college roommate, who was a great friend of mine, was living in Rome, and so I wasn't in touch with him all the time, but we were still good friends. And he wrote to me at one point and said that he had been feeling depressed. And I thought, oh, Terry is always full of good cheer and fun. He just means that he's feeling a little bit disappointed and sad. And I didn't take it terribly seriously, and I wrote him a cheerful email and said, you know, if there's anything I can do to help, let me know. And a few months later, he killed himself. And my blindness to what was going on remains shocking to me and remains deeply, deeply sad to me. And when I republished The Noonday Demon, I dedicated the new final chapter I wrote to Terry's memory. I'm going to quote to you from a few of the people whom I interviewed about depression, describing what it's like, because I think their experience supplements what I've just described with mine. This is someone named Laura Anderson, who wrote to me after I had an article in the New Yorker about depression. She said, I am not yet in a full-blown depression, but I'm slowing down a little. I mean that I have to focus on each thing I do on more and more levels. I'm not completely depressed at this point, but I have entered a recession. And then a week later, I only take baths now because the water beating down on me from the shower is too much to deal with in the morning and seems these days like a violent way to begin the day. Driving seems like such an effort. So does visiting the ATM, shopping, you name it. And then a little while afterward, the whole day thus far has been an exercise in forcing myself to do the tiniest things and trying to evaluate how serious my situation is. Am I really depressed? Am I just lazy? Is this anxiety from too much coffee or from too much antidepressant? The self-assessment process itself made me start to weep. And then she described going on an outing to the botanical garden with her boyfriend. And she said, by the description of one tree, it said, all parts deadly poisonous. I thought maybe I could find the tree, chew on a leaf or two, and curl up under a rock ledge and drift off. I miss the Laura who would have loved to put on her bathing suit and lie in the sun today and look at the blue, blue sky. Depression takes away whatever I really liked about myself, which is not so much in the first place. Feeling hopeless and full of despair is just a slower way of being dead. Now, one of the things that's important to think about in this context is the degree to which someone is isolated and the degree to which someone is tied into a fabric of other human beings. Because when I looked at questions of resilience, one of the things that struck me over and over again was that people who had a good set of human relationships had a better chance of getting better than people who didn't. And it's not a very useful prescription to say to people, you know what, if you only had 10 people who really loved you, you'd feel better. Now go out and do it. But I felt in reading Laura's descriptions in those many emails that she sent me over a long period of time, that they were really indicative of someone who had connections to a lot of people and was being just barely held in place by them. And I experience in the letters I get a shock of people's isolation, the isolation of people who are so isolated you've never met them, because if you had met them they would be less isolated. I get letters from people who wake up and turn on, eat some breakfast, and go to an office where they work in front of a machine, either a computer or a manufacturing machine, all day long without talking to anyone, and then pick up some food on the way home and eat dinner in front of a television and go to bed, and that is their lives, and they have no contact with anyone else. And the ones I hear from are the ones who have the wherewithal at least to write a letter. There are others who are so isolated that they aren't even doing that. So, grief and depression and sadness often get confused with one another. Sadness, as I've said, is a valuable emotion, though when it gets to be too much for too little cause, it can escalate into depression. Grief is usually about a specific loss, and you can often identify it because grief tends, while it waxes and wanes, essentially to be at its worst when a traumatic loss occurs, and then gradually become more manageable. While depression is often triggered by a traumatic event, but instead of ameliorating, it gets worse and worse and worse until you feel like it's swallowing you whole. It's too much grief at too slight a cause. I'm going to quote one other person whom I interviewed. This was someone who was one of my best friends. I knew her when I was in high school. We became very close in college. Freshman year, she escalated into mania. She had bipolar illness, and after her mania, she went into a catastrophic depression. And then she was put on lithium, and she did pretty well for a long time, for about 20 years. And then a really incompetent doctor said to her, "You've been fine for so long, why don't you try giving up the lithium?" And so she went off her lithium, and she soon was in psychosis again, and shortly after her psychosis, she plunged into the worst depression I've ever seen in my life. And I remember going to visit her where she was. She wasn't talking, she wasn't moving. She was staying with her parents who were then elderly and didn't know what to do with her. And when we talked about it afterward, she said, "I would lie in bed singing, 'Where have all the flowers gone?' over and over to occupy my mind. I realize now that I could have had some other drugs, or that I could have asked someone to come and sleep in my room, but I was just too sick to think of that. I couldn't say what scared me so much, but I thought I would explode from the anxiety. I just went down and down and down and down. We kept changing medications and I just kept going further down. I believed my doctors. I always accepted that I would eventually come back to normal. But I couldn't wait. I couldn't even do the next minute. The things my mind said were, you don't even deserve to live. You are worthless. You are never going to be anything. You're nobody." And that was when I really started thinking about killing myself. You don't think in depression that you've put on a gray veil and are seeing the world through the haze of a bad mood. You think the veil has been taken away, the veil of happiness, and that now you're seeing truly. You try to pin the truth down and take it apart, and you think the truth is a fixed thing, but the truth is alive, and it runs around. You can exorcise the demons of schizophrenics who perceive that there's something foreign inside them, but it's much harder with depressed people, because we believe we are seeing the truth, but the truth lies. that idea that truth lies is, I think, an absolutely essential idea in considering what depression is and considering what happens to people who are in it. People who are depressed come up with a mix of delusory and accurate beliefs. So someone who's depressed will say to you, nobody loves me. And you can say, actually, I love you, and your best friend loves you, and your kids love you, and you can put forward all kinds of contrary assertions. But people who are depressed also say things like, no matter what we do in this life, ultimately we're all just going to die. And you have to say, well, that's true, and it's not so great, but for the moment, we should think about getting up and having a nice day. And it's a constant struggle to try to help people through what really feels to them like authentic insight. And it is often authentic insight. There was a study that I particularly love to quote and mention whenever I talk about depression that was done of people playing a video game. And they played the video game for an hour, and at the end of an hour they were asked how many little monsters they thought they had killed. And the depressed people were mostly accurate to within about 10%. And the non-depressed people guessed between 15 and 20 times as many little monsters as they had actually killed. So depression is the family secret that everyone has. I started with that idea, this was mentioned in the introduction, of depression as a secret. And it's surprising to me how in being open about my own depression and in writing about it, how I've come to understand how unbelievably widely it affects people. You heard that it affects 20% or so of adults, but those are the people who are directly affected by it. But if you talk about depression with people and they themselves don't suffer from depression, they say, I'm so worried about my sister. My cousin has been being so strange. I don't understand why my boyfriend keeps being like this. Somewhere very close to them, there's someone who's depressed, and they too have had to deal with what that's like. I was at a conference a while ago in England, and I was at a great country house. It was a great conference. Friday afternoon, a woman took me aside. She said, you know, I've been suffering from depression and I'm a little confused about it, and I wanted to tell you what medications I'm taking and get some advice from you. And so I gave her whatever advice I could. And she finished and she said, my husband is at this conference. He's not the kind of man who can understand these things. Please don't tell him anything about what I've told you. So I said, no, of course, it's safe with me. On Sunday at that same conference, her husband took me aside. And he said, my wife wouldn't think I'm really a man if she knew this, but I've had this depression and I've been taking some medication and I wanted to ask you what you thought about it. And it turned out that they were hiding the same medication in 2 different places in the same room. And I mentioned to them that communication within their marriage might have something to do with the struggles they were facing. But the business of hiding depression is very consuming, and depression is exhausting, and getting well takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy from people whose symptoms include a lack of energy. And so you have to say to people, keeping secrets also takes a lot of energy. There's a family I've gotten to know quite well who are based in Michigan. The father of this family built all of the sunroofs that are in American-made cars that have sunroofs in them and amassed a great fortune. He was so anxious that anyone wouldn't discover that he suffered from depression that he refused to put a mental health provision in his company's healthcare plan because he thought if he did, it would look like he was interested in mental health and people would ask questions. And he managed to keep his struggles a secret, and he killed himself. And his children, who I've gotten to know, and his widow, have said to me, if only he poured all that energy into seeking treatment instead of into keeping it a secret, it would have made a great difference. Now, depression is very different from other illnesses. I started off in this field as a medical conservative, thinking, okay, there's such a thing as, there's talk therapy, there are medications, there's electroshock treatment, electroconvulsive therapy, there are these things that are established that work, and a lot of the other stuff that people talk about is ludicrous. And then I discovered that if you have brain cancer, and you say it makes you feel better to play with a yo-yo for 20 minutes every day, it may make you feel better, but you still have brain cancer, and with no other treatment, you will still probably die from it. But if you say you have depression, and it makes you feel better to play with the yo-yo for 20 minutes every day, then it's working. Because depression is a disease of how you feel. And if you feel better, that's an effective therapy for you. And I, over the years, have met so many people who have responded to so many of what sounded to me like strange and exotic therapeutic interventions, and who have done so well on them. And I've been fascinated just by the sheer range and diversity of them. I could talk to you for 3 hours about them. I will limit myself to saying that I had a particular favorite, which I've also quoted before, but which was a woman who wrote to me and said that she had tried medication and talk therapy and all kinds of other things, and she had found what really worked for her, which was making little things from yarn, some of which she sent me, and none of which I'm wearing. And she actually was making teddy bears, hundreds and hundreds of them, and I suggested she look up obsessive compulsive disorder in her copy of the DSM, but in fact, she really felt better when she was doing it. And I thought, you know what, if she feels better and she has room for the teddy bears, why not? Why not go on? I then went to look at the way in which depression has been understood in a variety of contexts. And as I said at the beginning, I wanted to break down the idea that it's a Western illness. And so I went and looked at depression among the Greenlandic Inuit, and I went and looked at a variety of extreme treatments for depression in other societies. And one of the places I went was to Senegal, where I went because there's a tribal ritual in Senegal for the treatment of depression. And I have a good friend who had, at that time, a Senegalese girlfriend, who is now his ex-wife. And he said that she had a friend who had been at school with the cousin of the sister, someone who knew her, some long line of connections, someone who actually performed this ritual called the Ndop. And so I went to Senegal, and I went off to interview this woman, Madame Diouf, who performed the Ndop. And I had a fascinating interview with her. We talked for a couple of hours, and at the end of it I said, well, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I said, look, is there any chance that I could actually see an Ndop being performed? And she said, well, I've never had a foreigner, a Tubal, as she called me. I've never had a foreigner who witnessed one before. She said, but you come through friends, and yes, if you would like to witness one, you may do so. And I said, that's fantastic. When will you next be performing one? And she said, oh, sometime within the next 6 months. And I said, that's quite a long time for me to stay here, waiting for this to happen. Wondered if it could be expedited for anyone. She said it didn't really work that way. So I said, well, it was wonderful meeting her, and I was sorry I wouldn't get to see one, but I really appreciated our conversation. And as we were leaving, she said, excuse me. And I said, yes. And she said, I hope you don't mind my saying this. And I said, what? And she said, you don't look so great yourself. I said, I've certainly never done this for a foreigner, but if you would like to have an Ndop done for you, I could do one. And I said, okay, sure. So I won't take you through the full details of the Ndop and all of what was involved in it, but I will tell you that the high point came when I was in a makeshift wedding bed with a ram in the central square of the village, and all of the villagers who had taken a day off from their work in the fields were throwing sheets of fabric over us, and I had to hold the ram. It would be very bad luck if he got away. I was not happy about this arrangement. And then all of a sudden, at a certain moment, all the fabric was pulled off, and I was yanked to my feet. The ram's throat was slit, my loincloth was pulled off, and I was covered in the blood of the freshly slaughtered ram. And I thought, this is a far cry from psychotherapy as a practice on the west side of New York. I had a very illuminating conversation a few years later when I was working in Rwanda, and I was working with someone to whom I recounted this whole experience. And he said, you know, we had a lot of trouble with Western mental health workers when we were in the aftermath of the genocide here. He said, well, we don't have any rituals that are very much like the one you've described. He said, there are elements that are in common. He said, and these people came over and they were supposed to be helping us. He said, and okay, they didn't involve drumming, which is what gets your blood up and flowing again when you're depressed. They didn't take people outside where you can actually experience the sunshine and have a sense of connection back into nature. They didn't characterize the depression as an external thing that had come and taken over you and that you could get rid of and expel. He said, and they didn't have the entire village come together and acknowledge what the problem was so that you could all be in it together. He said, instead, they did this bizarre thing. They took people one at a time into dingy little rooms and asked them to talk for an hour about bad things that had happened to them. He said, we had to ask them to leave the country. Now, at the other end of interventions for depression that are different from the commonplace ones are brain surgeries for depression, and that's an area in which actually there's been a lot of progress since the time that I first wrote the Noonday Demon. There now are a variety of procedures, including deep brain stimulation for people with very, very treatment-resistant depression. They have a little wire, effectively, like the one that gets used for Parkinson's disease, and it's put into any of several different areas of the brain, area 25 or the habenula, and when it's there, it stimulates those areas and appears to bring about the remission of depression in some people, sometimes with really quite astonishing results. Helen Mayberg, who's one of the people who developed these procedures, described having a patient on the table, and the patients have to be conscious while it's going on, so that you can tell if you've somehow accidentally gone in the wrong direction. And she doesn't tell them when she's turning the device on. And so she had put this device into someone's brain, and she turned it on, and he suddenly said, "What did you just do?" She said, "Why do you ask?" And he said, "All my life, I've been stuck in a room with 1,000 screaming children, and they just left the building." So one of the people I met when I was working on Noonday Demon was a guy named Frank Rusakov, who had, when I met him, the worst prognosis for his depression of almost anyone I'd ever come across. He was, at that point, in acute depression. He would have electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, which is still the most effective, though not the most pleasant treatment for depression. He would have ECT at the beginning of every month. He would be completely disoriented from it for a week. He would have a week of being sort of okay. He would have a week of going downhill, and then he would have a week of abject terror when he went back in for his next ECT treatment. And he said, "I can't live like this, and I have a plan for how to end it if I can't turn it around." But when I spoke to him, he said he had decided to have a procedure called a cingulotomy, which was a brain surgery. And I thought, isn't it remarkable that he's had such terrible depression and such terrible experiences with treatment, but buried somewhere inside that depression is enough optimism to try this rather frightening and intimidating treatment and to think, maybe this time I'll get well. And I didn't think he would, but he did. He had the cingulotomy, and he's now doing very well. He's married, he has 2 kids, he's turned into something of a different person. And this is part of what he said to me in a letter that he wrote to me the Christmas after the procedure. "My dad gave me 2 presents. First, a motorized CD rack. It's totally unnecessary and extravagant, but my dad knew I'd get a kick out of it. I opened this huge box and saw something I didn't need at all, and knew my dad was celebrating the fact that I'm living on my own, have a job I seem to love, and can pay my own bills. The other present was a photo of my grandmother who committed suicide. As I opened the present, I began to cry. She was beautiful. She's in profile, looking downward. My mom came over to the chair and asked if I were crying because of all the relatives I never knew. And I said, she had the same disease I have. I'm crying now as I write to you. It's not that I'm so sad, I just get overwhelmed. Maybe it's that I could have killed myself but didn't, because those around me convinced me to keep going, and I had the surgery. I'm alive and grateful to my parents and some doctors. We live in the right time, even if it doesn't always seem like it." Now, I will just say briefly that we think of depression as a modern illness. It is not a modern illness. Hippocrates and Plato had an ongoing feud because Hippocrates felt that depression was an organic dysfunction of the brain that should be treated with oral remedies. So he had the idea of antidepressants, even if he didn't have the antidepressants themselves. And Plato thought it was a philosophical problem that could be resolved only through discourse. So he had the idea of psychotherapy, even if he wasn't practicing it. And it's very funny to read the debates back and forth between the two of them and to see the directions in which they go. I'll just say briefly that I looked at depression among the indigent. Depression occurs when you have a vulnerability, and that vulnerability gets triggered by external circumstances. And when I was spending time with people who were getting treatment for depression, most of them were people who thought, my life is okay, why do I feel so bad? If your life is terrible and you feel bad, you don't wonder why you feel so bad. You think it makes perfectly good sense that you feel so bad. But it's often not that you feel so bad because your life is terrible, but that your life is terrible because you're too depressed to do anything about it. And there was one woman I spent a bit of time with who had been picked up in a survey in a health clinic in the inner city in DC, and who had then been brought into a treatment for depression, which she initially didn't think she had. And when I met her first, she talked about how terrible her life was. She said, I'm already small, and I'm just losing more and more weight. I don't get up to eat or anything. I just don't care. Sometimes I sit and just cry, cry, cry. Over nothing, I just cry. I just want to be by myself, and so on and so forth. And then she was pulled into this protocol, was given therapy and medication. And at the end of 6 months, I went to see her, and she said, my kids are so much happier. They want to do things all the time now. We talk hours every day, and they are my best friends. As soon as I come in the door, I put my jacket down purse, and we just get out books and read, doing homework all together and everything. We joke around. We all talk about careers, and before they didn't even think careers. My eldest wants to go to the Air Force, one wants to be a firefighter, one a preacher, and one of the girls is going to be a lawyer. I talk to them about things they've done and things they've seen, and they don't cry like they used to, and they don't fight like they did. I let them know they can talk to me about anything, I don't care what it is. I never thought I would get this far. It feels good to be happy, and everything keeps changing. The way I dress, the way I look, the way I act, the way I feel. I'm not afraid anymore. I can walk out the door not being afraid. I don't think those bad feelings are coming back, and if it weren't for Dr. Miranda and that, I'd still be at home in bed if I was still alive at all. I asked the Lord to send me an angel, and he answered my prayers. I then was writing an article for the New York Times Magazine. I wanted to about the experience of people emerging from severe depression. And so people who were indigent who were emerging from severe depression, and I submitted a story which included the tale of Lolly Washington that I've just read to you. And my editor called me and said, I really don't see how we can publish this. And I said, why not? And she said, because these people who come in completely dysfunctional and walk out ready to run Morgan Stanley, she said, it's just totally implausible and I've never heard of anything like it. And I said, the fact that you've never heard of anything like it is what makes it news. You're publishing a news magazine. This is the kind of story you want. I came to feel that it would serve not only the humanitarian but also the economic interests of the country to treat people like Lolly Washington, who became part of a productive economy and who turned around children who might have been headed toward delinquency and got them excited about having a very different kind of life. And I went and talked to people in Congress about it, and I spoke particularly to 2 senators, one of whom, who was a Republican, said it was very hard to put in line items about mental health, and that the Congress resisted additional mandates in the area of healthcare, and this has all obviously become very complicated in the debates around Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act. And the other one said, it would take a lot of political capital to set up programs that routinely cost people like the one you're describing, he said, and I described some others too. He said, we live in a representative democracy, and in a representative democracy, all of the voters have representation on Capitol Hill. The people you're talking about aren't in the polling places on election day. They're at home hiding under the bed with the door locked. He said, and nobody in Congress is going to expend political capital on helping them unless they understand that it will win them votes. That has to be part of the equation, and it will only happen if people who aren't those people become awake enough to care about them. And that is why I always tell their stories when I come through. Now, I said that part of what I was interested in was whether some people who had very severe depression seemed to do very well in some ways despite it. And what I came to understand is that some people go through a depression and then they try to push it away and never to look at it or think about it again. And the people who do that, by and large, are the ones who are most haunted by it, because depression is a cyclical illness. If you've had one depression, you're likely to have another. If you've had 2 depressions, you're almost certain to have a third. And people who have integrated the story of depression into the narrative of their lives are not disrupted and destroyed every time the depression comes again. They understand it as something they're going through. And people who think of the depression as something that they don't ever want to look at or ever want to think about are ambushed each time as badly as they were the first time. And so I said to the people whom I was writing about, I said, how do you manage to do that? And what good do you find in your depression? And I'll quote to you from the three people who I quoted to you from in the beginning. This is Frank Rusikoff, who had the cingulotomy. He said, if I had it to do over, I wouldn't do it this way. But I think I've gained a lot and grown a lot because of it. I've become a lot closer to my parents, to my brother, to friends. I have this experience with my doctor that's been very good. There really are upsides in depression. It's just hard to see them when you're in it. I said I would do it differently if I had it to do over again, and I guess I would. But now that I feel like the worst is over, I'm grateful for having been where I've been. I do believe I'm better off having been to the hospital 30 times and having had brain surgery. I've met a lot of good people along the way and learned a lot about love. And Maggie Robbins, who was the bipolar woman who talked about the veil of happiness and the idea that the truth lies, said, I used to get nervous a lot, and I would just talk and talk. And then I started volunteering at an AIDS residence. They had teas there, and I was supposed to help get the tea and cake and juice for the patients, and sit with them and chat, because many of them didn't have people to visit them and were lonely. I remember one day early on, I sat down with some people and tried to kick off a conversation by asking them what they'd done for their 4th of July. They told me, but they just weren't keeping up their end of the conversation at all. And I thought, this is not very friendly or helpful of them. And then it hit me. They weren't going to talk at all. They didn't want me to leave. So I decided I'm here with them and I'm going to be with them. It's simply going to be an occasion when I'm a person who doesn't have AIDS and doesn't look really sick and isn't dying, but who can tolerate the fact that they do, and they are. And so I just stayed with them that afternoon without talking. The lovingness that you are there, simply paying attention unconditionally. If suffering is what the person is doing right then, that's what they're doing. You're being with that, not trying like crazy to do something about it. I've learned how to do that. Our needs are our greatest assets. I'm able to just be there with people because of the stuff I've needed from people. I guess I've learned to give all the things I need. And Laura Anderson, who wanted to chew up the leaf from the tree in the botanical garden and die on a ledge, said, depression has given me kindness and forgiveness where other people don't know enough to extend it. I am drawn toward people who might put others off with a misplaced bar or a wrong move. I had an argument about the death penalty tonight with someone, and I was trying to explain without being too self-referential that one can understand horrifying actions, understand the terrible links between mood and job and relationships and the rest of everything. I would never want depression to be a public or political excuse, but I think that once you've gone through it, you get a greater and more immediate understanding of the temporary absence of judgment that makes people behave so badly. You learn even, perhaps, how to tolerate the evil in the world. So, valuing the depression does not prevent relapse, but it makes the relapses tolerable. It gives you a mechanism to handle them. And I find that I think of my depression every day, and it recurs from time to time, and then I think of it a lot. I think of it every day. I said the opposite of depression is not happiness but vitality, and I have felt that absence of vitality and that funeral in my brain. But I find and I cling to whatever joy there may be. I see the happiest parts of my life in more dramatic contrast because they go against those particular difficulties and miseries. And each day, I gamely side with the reasons for living, and that is a privileged rapture. Thank you.
We have handheld your side of the room, so if you put your hand up, we'll do our best to get a mic to you.
Pardon me?
Thank you for coming. So I've had experiences taking really difficult classes through my freshman year here, and oftentimes it is that ability, feeling that I don't know what to do, and even though I have all of the questions and steps in front of me, it's kind of tough to feel a little bit of hump starting, but once I'm on the other side of it, it feels much better. And after talking to many friends and mentoring younger students, after being here for a while, I realized that that feeling of trying to figure something out but being scared to do it is really common. So is that sort of a rite of passage in order to become a good student, or is there something that higher education institutions can do to help students get over that?
I think part of the experience of freshman year isn't necessarily of being overwhelmed. I think colleges set out in some ways to overwhelm you. They expect a degree of independence and competence greater than there could before, and they judge what you do more harshly than it was probably judged in high school. And I think everyone has to go through an adjustment when they get to college, and then another adjustment when you start having an actual full-time job after college or after grad school or whatever you do in the outside world. I think a lot of the time, the problem is that we see problems as massive and monumental, and we feel as though we have to do something massive and monumental to solve them. And often, you know, it's that old cliche, a journey of whatever it is, 1,000 miles begins with a single step. If you start doing the work that's needed on a small scale, it will eventually accumulate into something that's big enough and meaningful enough to do. That sense of being overwhelmed and unequal does not go away. I'm working on a book now, and I'm in the middle of doing interviews, and I feel like the interviews are incredibly interesting, but incredibly diffuse, and I don't know how they're ever going to fit together, and I feel like I can't see the book, and it makes me terribly anxious. But I know that I felt this way about my last few books, and that eventually they came into focus, and so there's a certain amount of just soldiering on. But I can now think about it, and people will remind me, you know, they'll say, remember when you were writing Far from the Tree, you had exactly that feeling, you had all of these problems, and it was so incredibly difficult for you, and I say, ah, yes, now I do remember that. They say, well, it's just the same thing again. The first time, when you're first experiencing that, is very, very difficult. And you know, some tasks can be more easily broken down into smaller steps than others. And sometimes you have more time to break tasks into smaller steps, and sometimes you have to get through things really quickly because you have so much work and have so little time compared to how much work you have to do. I think that's why, one of the many reasons why there's such a high rate of depression on college campuses, and the rate of depression on college campuses is shockingly high. I think it comes from that sense of being overwhelmed and out of your depth, and I think people have it around their work, and I think they have it around social situations too, and building these new friendships and relationships, and being free from parental supervision for many people for the first time, and so on and so forth. I think there's a lot that's overwhelming all at the same time. And I think the trick of it is to try to break it into constituent parts, and also to think it's meant to be difficult, and I'm supposed to be overwhelmed, and part of the journey I'm on is to get through that overwhelmness to the point where I can function better, and I'm doing what I was set to do. It's not that everyone else is doing it easily and I can. And it's great if you can have honest conversations with other people, because the other people around you are going through many of the same things, and often they're putting images on Instagram that make you think that they're only having a glorious fun time, and they're all kinds of stuff. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned sort of an internal question of whether or not medication makes you more of yourself or makes you into somebody else. I was wondering if you have ever kind of settled that question for yourself, or maybe other stories, others' experience with it has kind of answered that for you.
You know, I've established it for myself insofar as I take medication, and I expect to continue to take medication, and I live with this sort of various side effect. I feel like people say, oh, you're taking those happy pills so that you'll feel really wonderful. But I feel like when I was depressed, I felt incredibly overwhelmed and anxious and sad about taking a shower. And I felt incredibly anxious and sad about getting into bed at night. And I felt incredibly anxious and overwhelmed and sad about having to answer my cell phone when it rang. And I feel like when I'm not depressed, I feel incredibly overwhelmed and anxious and sad about global warming. And I feel incredibly anxious and sad about not knowing how my book is ever going to turn out, and about other things. And so I feel like I haven't had a real change in personality, it's just changed the focus, and for me it's much healthier to be focused elsewhere. Depression is a disease of self-obsession, among other things, where you mostly are looking inward because your inner pain is so enormous. And I wanted always to live a life in which I was outward in the world. And I think that's more or less what I was like when I was in college and before I had my first major depressive episode. And so I revert, I think, to the person I thought I was going to be. But I ask myself the question all the time, it's never fully resolved. You know, I think to myself, okay, I get kind of physically tired some of the time. I think I wonder if I can take these medications, whether I would get tired so easily, and whether I would need so much sleep. And I have other things, I mean, I could come up with a long list, but where I think to myself, I wonder what that would be like without the medication. You know, people say to me all the time, I have this illness, but I didn't want to take any medication because I just didn't want to do that to myself. I wanted to deal with things in the natural way. And there are two responses I have to that. One of them is that we do a lot of things that are unnatural. I mean, it's unnatural to wear clothing, but nobody is out there sort of trying to prevent t-shirts from being sold because they're unnatural. So we do a lot of unnatural things in order to live and function in the world. I recognize that this one is different from some others, but I think it's nonetheless an essential one. And I also think that people who are depressed will say, well, you know, usually it only lasts for about a year. And I think, yeah, but you're never going to be 21 again. You know, you're only 21 for a year, and life is short. And if we're going to have to lose a year every 3 years to being terribly depressed, and you don't have to be doing that, you know, grab life and live it as well as you can. Now, that doesn't mean medication is right for everyone. Some people are philosophically opposed to it. Some people it doesn't work for. Some people get too many side effects. I mean, there are many reasons for people not to take medication too. And I don't think there is a universal treatment. As I said before, you know, if you find having an exorcism in Senegal will do it for you, go for it. I met people who had the MDOT who said it had transformed their lives. But I don't think people should be afraid of medication. They can choose against it, but they shouldn't be afraid of it.
There's been a focus recently, maybe in this political era also, of a kind of a pull that many of us feel about our general condition and man's inhumanity to man, and a lot of old questions which seem particularly fraught again for us. And the idea is that we see things and we have insight about very unrelevant things about ourselves and others and what we are or aren't doing to try to alleviate suffering and inequality and so on. And compassion seems like a thing we keep coming to, compassion for oneself and the sort of exercise and mastery of compassion, especially when you feel least entitled to it because you're unworthy by your narcissistic obsession with wanting to be happier than you are. And I just wanted you to hear what you thought about that.
Well, I mean, I think we do live in a moment of a crisis in compassion. The rate of hate crimes is up, as I think everybody knows. The extent to which we fully integrate people who are different into our society is down. I think a lot of people have felt very threatened by the move toward greater openness. And I think there's, and I don't know the politics of this college or of this room, but I think that there has been a lot of cruelty directed against immigrants in particular, and that it has resulted in very dangerous situations for people who are in most instances, and not in all, but who are in most instances, trying very hard and working very hard. And the idea that because I happen to have been born on US soil and you happen to have been born 10 miles away, I should have all these privileges and you shouldn't have all these privileges. It's a moral conundrum to try to work that one through. I think it's very, very difficult. I think the people I know who are depressed are often, as I said, quite inward focused. I don't want to say they're narcissistic because that's not quite true, but inward focused because the pain is so great and it's all they can do to move from moment to moment. The people who have been depressed, I think often come out with a much greater sense of compassion and humanity. And I think having felt that degree of vulnerability in yourself, as I said in the talk, really gives people a better basis for treating other people kindly and humanely. But you need a little bit of tutelage to get to that point. The people who get depressed and then never want to think about it again don't always get to that point. It's the people who've been depressed and have tried to learn from their depression and have said, like Frank said, I wouldn't have chosen this, but now that it's happened, I'm glad that it's what I've done and what I've been. You know, is he really glad? I mean, he would not have chosen it, and I imagine that if he could choose right now to erase it, he would have to give it some pretty serious thought. But I think in this political moment, we need the voices of people who are acquainted with vulnerability to say that there should be love and justice for everyone.
Hi, I'm a graduate student in the mental health counseling program, and I have my own experience with mental health, as both personal and relational with loved ones. And I was wondering if you had any advice for upcoming clinicians that live with mental illness and are also treating mental illness.
Well, you know, the tide has turned. For a long time, if you were a clinician, you could never, ever tell anyone that you had mental illness, because the understanding was that the patient is vulnerable and weak, and that the clinician has to be a tower of strength and represent complete normality and somehow bring the patient back up to that standard. Now I think it's increasingly evident that it's often helpful for people to know that their doctor has been through some pain and some difficulty and knows what they're talking about, and isn't just this sort of impervious cliff wall, doesn't recognize what's gone on. There are questions about how open people should be, and different clinicians have made different decisions about how open to be about their experience with mental illness. There are some who say that they really have been willing to talk about it very openly and very loudly, and there are some patients who are attracted to that. There are some people who occasionally will tell a patient, I too have encountered that, or who will say, someone very close to me had exactly the same situation that you did. It's a matter of balance, and it's a matter of personality, and different people look for different things in therapists. And in the same way that I think it was wrong to say no therapist should ever admit to having mental illness, I think it would be wrong to say every therapist who's ever dealt with mental illness has to make a big announcement about it. I think there is no absolute. I think there has to be something that's negotiated by each individual therapist and then by each therapist with patients. When Kay Jamieson wrote her book, An Unquiet Mind, about her experience with manic depressive illness, Kay Redfield Jamieson, wonderful, wonderful book, shorter than mine. She gave up practicing as a clinician because she felt that she had now said that she had manic depressive illness and that nobody would want to be in treatment with someone who had said that, or that it was not that it broke down some necessary boundaries between her and her patients. And she now gets thousands of letters from people saying, would you be my treating clinician? So the book has actually given people a feeling of great intimacy. But I think that represents a larger shift in the way that psychology is works altogether, which is to say that I think there was a long period when the model was a psychoanalytic model in which the therapist said very little, and the room that you met in was not particularly cozy or inviting, in which it felt like it was a very austere practice. And I think we now live in a time when therapy has become much more compassionate, and when that sense of the therapist being completely removed has disappeared, and when you have an authentic relationship with the therapist, and it's not just your projections, but your actual relationship with the therapist within which you work out the conflicts that haunt you. And that, I think, is a healthier way for therapy to have it.
Hi, thanks for coming. I'm just curious, meditation and Buddhism and yoga are now like the new things for treating depression. And I was wondering if you've practiced any of those things and if you've found them to be effective in your life in any way.
I don't practice them in any formal way. I'm not trained in meditation practices, and I don't do yoga. I know many, many, many people who do and who have found them enormously helpful. And indeed, my shrink has said to me from time to time that I should take up meditation. And my closest friend, who is the godmother to my son, was depressed and took up meditation and was quite transformed by it. It was enormously helpful to her. I keep trying to figure out how to work it into a schedule with 2 young kids and books to write and everything else. I feel like taking another hour out of every day sounds overwhelming to me, and I haven't done it, but I sort of wish that I had. So I can't talk to you from personal experience, but I can say that these other people around me have been, really have found that it's given them a lot of stability, that it's given them it's especially helpful, I think, with anxiety rather than with depression, though it can be helpful with both, but anxiety often abates to some degree when you engage in these practices. And of course, there have been all of those amazing brain studies of Tibetan monks that show that certain areas of their brains are enlarged and other areas are minimized, and that they're sort of relatively, as it were, Zen relationship to things emerges in part from a real change in brain architecture that's achieved through regular meditation. So it's not just a kind of touchy-feely, fashionable thing. I think it has real and concrete effects.
How about one last question?
And then I'll be around, and I'm happy to talk to people if you want to come up to me afterwards.
Hi, I serve as the undergraduate government mental health chair, and at Boston College I've had a lot of conversations with students who sought counseling and were either turned away or left with insufficient resources due to the fact that so many students were seeking those out and due to understaffing. To me that's an indicator of a problem, and I was wondering what you think the responsibility of the university is in supporting its student body's mental health, and how could a university improve that?
I think across the board that there are two phenomena which coexist. One is that there are a lot of people getting unnecessary therapy and unnecessary medication. There are people who imagine themselves to have a problem, who are completely wrapped up in the idea of themselves as having a problem, who spend thousands of dollars and thousands of hours getting treatment that they don't really probably need. And we have over-treatment of people with relatively mild conditions. And the other problem, which is a much bigger problem, is the grotesque under-treatment of people who would be responsive to adequate medication or psychotherapy or whatever other intervention would be, yoga and meditation perhaps, but who would be responsive to some kind of intervention and they aren't getting it. And they go and they seek it, and it's a big, difficult thing to go and seek it. It is not easy for the first time to walk into the office of a relative stranger and say, I suffer from this condition, or I think I suffer from this condition, or I have these symptoms, or I'm just really scared all the time, or whatever it is that somebody goes in and admits, and to try to solicit help and to get help. And so I think we have this scandalous situation in which the treatment resources are not well allocated. I don't know the details of how the mental health services work on this particular campus, but looking at college campuses in general, I think that we see a microcosm of that same problem, that we have people who have somehow managed to get themselves into treatment because they have big theatrical personalities and are able to put themselves forward, or because they have such shrinking personalities that they are evidently incredibly vulnerable, but that there are a lot of people who are having terrible problems and who are not getting help. There's a distinction drawn between low-functioning depression and high-functioning depression. And in low-functioning depression, you feel so bad that you can't get out of bed, and you don't get out of bed. And in high-functioning depression, you feel like you can barely get out of bed, but somehow you drag yourself to your classes, or you drag yourself to whatever else it is you have to drag yourself to. And people who are more high-functioning depressives often get much less treatment than people with low-functioning depression. So while it looks better to be able to get to your classes, you may be escalating towards suicide anyway, and you may be escalating toward it more rapidly because you have the confidence and the wherewithal to organize yourself to terminate your own life. And then people will see you and they'll say, well, you're taking 4 classes, you're doing okay in them, this isn't that serious, we aren't going to give you a lot of resources, and that's a terribly dangerous and problematical situation. So I would say that we really need to have mental health services on all university campuses. We need to have better screening. I mean, there are really good screening tools for depression, for suicidality, and they're standard on some campuses and they're not standard on others. But there are a lot of people who have depression who wouldn't think of it and who wouldn't go in to look at it, but who, when they take one of these inventories, prove to have quite a lot of symptoms of depression. And there are people who seem like they can barely cope with anything, but when they sit down with the inventory are doing fairly well. They're not foolproof, these measuring guides, but they're very helpful and very useful. And if you had every freshman who comes in go through a screening process so that you could then say, okay, if you think you need help, you can come and get help. You don't think you need help, but we think you need help and we'd really like you to come and get help. And you had a system in which you pulled people in, that would be much better. And for there to be waiting lists at a university that's as relatively, or college that's as relatively prosperous as this one, it happens everywhere. It's not just this place. It's true of every major university. But there are waiting lists everywhere, and there shouldn't be, because these problems are urgent, and frankly, they're particularly urgent in young people. If you've managed to live to the age of 40, you've developed a certain degree of resilience one way or another, and if you're going to the shrink for the first time and you have to wait an extra month, you're probably better equipped to do it. If you're 18 and you're first away from home and you're coming apart at the seams, and you go and you ask for help and you don't get it, the despair that that can engender and the likelihood of agony or suicide or damage or dropping out or all kinds of other things is enormous. So I know budgets are complicated, I know staffing is complicated, I know sorting through students is complicated. There have to be better mental health services on this campus and on every other one.
Thank you.
If I can, just a word about books. So there was a slight weather-related snafu, and we do not have hard copies of books, but we have a solution. You can order copies of Dr. Solomon's books outside, and there's a discount of 20% because of that and free shipping to your address. And we have come up with a, not perfect, but a workable solution for signing, because Dr. Solomon is willing to sign. We have pieces of paper that are here that can work in lieu of, I know it's not perfect, but in an imperfect world, in lieu of signing the actual hard copy. So he's going to sit here, and if you would go outside of this room, you can order books. Come back in and please line up alongside this wall once you've purchased books or want to get a signature from Dr. Solomon. May I just also add that our next Park Street event will be in the same room, March 28th. Damon Tweedy will be coming. He is author of Black Man in a White Coat, so please join us then. And please join us again in thanking Andrew Solomon for being here.